Welcome to Therapist Success School, where today we are going to be talking about a skill that is common, that is often used by both clients and therapists, a skill that is talked about frequently, but is not necessarily done masterfully or understood well by both clients and also sometimes by therapists. But this skill is arguably one of the most important communication skills and one of the most impactful skills that you can use as a therapist in your sessions. And the impact of using the skill masterfully will change your sessions now and forever. So let's get into it. We're going to be talking about validation today. Now, I know that most of us as therapists, we probably feel like we know what validation is, and we might also feel like we know how important it is. Validation and the term validation is used so frequently in just general language now, right? It's just a normal part of the zeitgeist to talk about validation. People might say, I need you to validate me, or could you please validate me, or I validate your experience. So that's very common. However, using validation therapeutically is and clinically might have a little bit more content and details than that. And so let's get into it so we can really become more strategic and use validation in a way that is going to up level our clinical sessions and get the absolute most out of the time with our clients. So, like a lot of topics, sometimes it makes more sense to start with what something is not versus what it is. So, for example, things like acceptance or radical acceptance or forgiveness are topics that often we have to help people understand what those things are not, because there's a lot of myths, misperceptions, fallacies around those concepts, so that we can also help them understand what it is. And validation is no exception to that rule. In fact, very often people will kind of in a colloquial way use the language of validation or talk about it in a way that actually isn't what validation is. So let's first get clear that what validation is not is it's not approval, and it's not agreeing with somebody, with anybody about something. So validation is not approval, and it's not agreeing. Now, you're going to see why that is so important in just a moment to really understand what validation is not as we talk about what it is and how to really on purpose intentionally use validation in sessions and the power of that validation. What validation is, however, is seeing life through the client's eyes, so much so that their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors make sense. Seeing life through the client's eyes, where their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors make sense. They make sense to the therapist, and the therapist then communicates that. So part of validating is not just seeing life through the client's eyes, but then also communicating that out loud to the client and expressing why and how it makes sense, so that then there is a bridge that is being created between the client and the therapist related to that issue. Okay, so here's what validation often sounds like. It often sounds like, yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense where you're coming from there. Or, yeah. So when you look at it that way, or when I look at it through your perspective, or when I think about how you're experiencing life or what's happened in the past, it makes sense that you would feel that way, right? Validation can also sound like or look like you saying, I hear you. I hear you. I hear where you're coming from there. That resonates. That makes sense that you might do this or might do that. And what you're probably hearing is that the phrase "it makes sense" is such a validating sentence and is often one of the ones that is going to be the easiest for therapists to use and to incorporate into sessions in order to um, communicate validation. The phrase "it makes sense" is such an easy way to begin to validate somebody. And it's going to be a way or a phrase that you might use a lot. If you don't already, then perhaps after this video. Now, before, remember when I said that there's what validation is not and what validation is. So very often people will say, "Oh, I'm not validating that. I don't agree with that." And that's the trick of validation, is that you do not have to agree with the person nor approve of them in order to validate them. And here's one of my favorite examples of what that can look like in session. And one of my favorite examples, I what I love about it is that it's really kind of absurd, and that is that the if the client says, let's say a client said to us, "So Beth, I was just furious. I was so angry. I came home and I was just so mad about what happened. And then the dog was like just yipping at my heels, and the dog kept barking. So, I kicked him. I kicked him right across the room. I mean, I was so angry, and I just kicked him across the room because, he deserved it. He's such a pain. He's always barking. And I was just so pissed that day. Now, I do not agree with kicking a dog as a therapist or as any human. I also do not approve of my client kicking their dog, regardless of reason. However, I can still validate them. So you might be like, "What, Beth? How do you validate somebody that kicked a dog?" I'm going to show you. So the way that you validate somebody, even if you don't approve or agree, because approving and agreeing is not important for validation, is that it would sound something like this. "Ah, yeah, John, I hear you. So you were just so angry that day, and you had, so many things that were so frustrating, and then the dog was barking underneath your heels, and you were just over the top angry, and you kicked the dog because you had a hard time coping. You kicked the dog because of that." And then John would say, "Yeah, yeah, I did." He'd say, "Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense when you're that angry. And then you also don't have like the way to cope with it. Why we may just act out and do something like kick a dog. It makes sense." Now, what you probably noticed there is that I didn't agree with him. I didn't approve of it, but I stepped into his world, saw life through his eyes and his experience. And I said, "Yes, it makes sense that you were that angry and you didn't have the coping skills. And so you kicked the dog, you took it out on the dog. That makes sense." Now, some of you might be like, "Whoa, Beth, are we then leaving it there?" And the thing is that validation gives us an opportunity to do what I'm going to call kind of like part two. And this part two is "and also." Okay. Now, I was a DBT therapist for over 10 years. So, DBT does an extraordinary job of just hammering concepts into DBT therapists to make sure that they adhere to the model. When I say an extraordinary job, I mean a great job. And one of the things that DBT hammers away at the therapist is to become masterful at validation, to become so masterful at it that it becomes an organic part of you. It just becomes a natural part of your sessions to be validating all the time. And the reason why is so important in DBT is because there is an awareness in DBT that if we do not validate a client about their feelings, their experiences, their intensity, what they're going through, their perspective, then if we're not able to validate them, then we can't join them. And if we can't join them, then we're not in a therapeutic alliance with them. If we are unable to validate them, then they're here and we're here. And they might need to try to keep convincing us of their reality. And if we don't validate their reality, we might actually end up arguing with their reality instead, right? So we might be like, but John, you can't, it doesn't matter how angry you get, you can't kick the dog. Or, but John, you that thing that happened wasn't even something to make you angry enough to do something like kick a dog. But John, you have to be able to control yourself better than that, right? So in DBT, that those kinds of responses are recognized as ones that will not help the client. They're going to cause the client to just feel shame or judged. And that will have a lot of repercussions in the session. The client will think she doesn't really understand me. She doesn't understand what I'm experiencing. So I either need to keep trying to convince her of how I'm feeling, or I might just withdraw and not share anything else with her anymore. Or I might withdraw and just keep my own experiences to myself. Or I might not share some of the other really difficult thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that I have, the other things that might be very embarrassing or shameful to me, because I know that this therapist here is not really going to understand me. So because there's so many difficult behaviors that we're working with in DBT, that the clients show up with often a lot of distorted thoughts, distorted beliefs, difficult intensities with emotions, maybe a lot of challenges in relationships, that if the therapist is unable to really understand what life is like for that client, the therapist will be completely ineffective. So what DBT does is it says, well, we have to validate. And of course, this concept applies to personal relationships too, but it is incredibly important and strategic in DBT to make sure that we are using validation in order to be able to help the client best. And then, of course, that transcends DBT, and validation is essential to help any client anywhere at any time, right? So if the client's here and we're here, validation enables us to come over to where they are, see life through their eyes, and then be able to help them go like this. She understands me. Once we understand them and they feel understood, it actually gives us more room, more space, kind of buy-in, in order to also be able to introduce insights, tools, skills, other suggestions that may help the client to navigate these types of scenarios differently in the future, that may help the client to be able to make change, right? But without validation first, then we are not coming over to where the client is. Without validation, then the client may not be open to learning those skills, those tools, or those insights, and may instead stay entrenched in feeling right in their reality, right? And that won't help the client. So the therapist must actually be great at validating the client coming over to where they are, because that sort of creates a bridge. It creates a bridge to come over to where the client is, to see the world through their eyes, to be truly empathetic. And then also, it is like a key. It opens the door for the introduction of skills, tools, insights, suggestions that the client may consider, entertain, or learn in order to be able to make change. So validation, I view as both a bridge to connect with the client and create an alliance, and then the key to be able to open the door for them to be open to learning some of the things that may help them, or considering other alternatives. Otherwise, without validation, people stay very entrenched in their positions. All right, so now what I said before was that validation allows us to then, the part two is the and also, right? So we always validate first. Validation is just clutch. It's all session long. It's constant. And then the and also is where we might give some of the other parts of the information, the skills, the tools, the insights that follow that validation. So that might be something like this. Oh, John, I hear you. That sounds really hard. It sounds like you were just off the Richter scale with your anger. It was really intense anger that day. And then on top of that, the dog was yipping at your heels, and you really lost it, right? You lost control there, and you ended up kicking the dog. And I hear you, that there was a lot of fallout from kicking the dog. It was, you had to take the dog to the vet, and also you felt guilty about harming the dog, and your kids were upset about it. And that sounds really hard, all of that. It really makes sense why all of this happened. And also, it lets us know that you have some moments where your anger gets really over the top, right? It gets really pretty activated. So, you and I, better really help you learn a bunch of skills and tools that you can use for moments just like that so that you don't end up doing something like kicking the dog again. This lets us know how important it is to learn those skills and tools. And then John might say, oh, it's so true, Beth. I mean, I was so angry, and sometimes that anger just takes control of me, and I feel like I'm just seeing red. And you're right. I need to learn some other way to handle it, because if I don't, I'm gonna do things like kick the dog again, and that's not good. I don't want to do that. Right. So validation not only enables us to connect with the client and create a real team alliance with them, but also it makes room, it opens them up to the end also. And also, it looks like we really need to learn a bunch of skills and tools here. And also, it seems like we need to focus today on what kind of skill you could use in that moment when you were that angry, so that you don't harm the dog and you don't harm anybody else. Right? That's the end also. And validation creates that space for that. Okay, so um, why is it so essential and then also so effective to validate a client throughout session, but also in some of those really hard moments? So it helps the client to feel truly understood and truly heard, truly seen, right? Sometimes clients are saying things from a reality that we cannot relate to. They might have a very distorted belief about something. They may have a very distorted expectation of relationships, and or from and their feelings might seem very disoriented, or too intense for the conditions that happened, or their reaction to things may seem disproportionate to what the events were. And in those moments, if we're not able to validate them and understand that experience for them, really look at it through their eyes, then how are we going to help them from that point forward? If we can't even really align with where they're at because it seems so foreign to us, how are we going to help them with the next part? And how are they going to feel seen and heard in that experience, right? So it helps them to feel understood and heard. It also reduces resistance. So when we validate, then the client often softens. The resistance, the push, the not being willing to change that is often present for all of us, but certainly maybe some of the clients you've worked with, that resistance softens when somebody feels validated. It also helps them, or helps you and them, to put down what I'm going to call the tug of war rope. So sometimes in session with a client, if you are not being masterful at validation, what can happen is that it feels like there's a tug of war rope, right? Where the client is holding on to a position that they're in, and you're on the other side pulling, and they're over here pulling, right? So let's say that you're trying to convince somebody not to self harm, or you are trying to help a client no longer, obsessively text their ex-boyfriend, or you're trying to help the client to not drink and drive. Well, if when you're doing those things, if the session is absent of masterful validation, it might start feeling like there's a tug of war. They're pulling and you're pulling. And that is not an ideal state for therapy, right? Because who wins? Do we win if we pull them over and yank them to where we are? Is that really winning? Is that real therapeutic change, or is that just dominance, right? And if they win, meaning we just give up, and they win, then they just stay with the same behaviors and don't change, which is not meeting their goals either. So when we feel this push and pull, anytime you feel the push and pull with a client, that is a golden moment to say, I need to drop the rope and let me validate so I can come over to where they are. So if I validate them, if I say, yeah, I mean, it is really, really hard to stop drinking, let alone to stop a behavior like drinking and driving because you're so used to it. I mean, you've been doing it for years. You've never gotten caught. You've never gotten to an accident. It makes sense why you would, think this is, I'm not going to get hurt doing this. I'm not going to get in trouble. I've been doing it for 30 years. It makes sense that you're not really motivated to change that. I get it. That makes sense. Now I came over to where the client is. There's no more tug of war, and it's going to create discussion here. The client goes, she gets me. And we have room for the and also. That might be like at some point, and also, what if it changes? What if you do get into an accident? What if you do hurt somebody? Maybe that's something we need to talk about too, right? So, validation enables us to put that tug of war rope down. And it also creates that very strong therapeutic alliance. The client feels like I have a teammate here who is not judging me, who is not shaming me. And we know clients often are plagued by judgment and shame, self judgment. And when they have a therapist that judges them or shames them or has a strong opinion about their life or their experiences, it causes clients to withdraw or not fully engage or to experience even more shame in their life, which is not a useful therapeutic experience, right? So, validation is so essential and so effective with all of those things. Now, when to use it. So, I just want to plug that if you want to become great at validation, start using it in your personal life also. Like, use it like, hot sauce, put it on everything. We can and should be validating all the time. It's an essential communication skill. It's an effective communication skill. It's pretty easy to do once we get the hang of it, especially when we realize that it's not approval, it's not agreeing, and that instead it's just understanding where the client is and how they look at life, and that it creates that bridge and it creates that key. But so the truth is that validation is one of the most effective communication skills, and it can and should be used in our personal lives in a very liberal way all the time, and in our professional lives with our clients. And certainly if you have any employees or people that you work with or people you work for, everyone. So we also want validation though to become sort of an organic experience, that we're so comfortable with it. We're so familiar with the process of validating that it becomes a normal part of us. It becomes an organic way that we communicate. So much so that it's just is happening all the time in session, which is translating to the client in a powerful way that they're not judged, they're understood, they've been heard, and that they have a true therapeutic alliance that wants the best for them as well, that wants to help them achieve their own goals, and that creates the openness to be able to do that. Um, and so eventually what we want is validation and masterful validation to become second nature and to feel automatic, right? Even though in the beginning it might feel like you kind of really have to work at it a bit. um, and also we want to make sure we are absolutely using the skills of validation strategically when, and especially when, we have a client that feels misunderstood in front of us, when the client lacks insight into their own behavior, when the client seems very sensitive or defensive, when the client has a personality disorder or it might have a lot of black and white thinking, and also whenever you as a therapist want to be heard by the client, right? So if you want to be heard by the client, it is essentially you validate the client's experience because that will make them more open to hearing what you are saying or sharing as well. Okay. Now, what's going to happen if you don't become more masterful at validation? If you're like, is it really that important of a skill? What's going to happen in your sessions? Well, first of all, they're going to keep going along any way that they are right now, and they may already be going great, and so that's wonderful. However, some of the consequences of not using masterful validation is the tug of war with clients, is trying to convince clients to change or to make a shift in some kind of a behavior, because that's what happens is we end up trying to convince people because we actually don't have buy-in from them. They are not on the same team with us. We are not on the same team with them. The client may feel judged or feel like we're the moral police, which is absolutely not what therapist roles are. We are not here to judge. We are not here to be the moral police. We are not here to push the right and wrong of life. There are things that are not okay that clients do that we are a part of the process of helping them to change. However, it is through validation that we are most likely to gain that change and not through some kind of heavy handed judgment or opinionated stance on the therapist's part. Um, if you don't become masterful at validation, the teamwork piece is unlikely to truly be there with clients. And lastly, you're more likely to lose the client prior to them achieving the goals that they have. So clients get frustrated by that. They feel helpless or hopeless. They feel unsupported. They don't feel understood, and it's more likely to affect your client retention and your not just your client retention numbers in general, and your career stability in general, but also the actual retention of that individual client that I know you care deeply about and care deeply about them achieving the changes that they want in their lives, that only through validation you will be able to help them do. Especially if some of the other conditions exist that we talked about before. So, validation is a priceless, incredibly important tool for therapists to be using automatically, organically, constantly, and also quite strategically. Any moment that you sense that you feel sort of tension in the session, it's a moment for you to pause and reflect and say, am I using validation here really strategically? Am I using it masterfully? Any moment that you feel that there's a push and pull with the client, any moment that you feel that the client is not really feeling understood, any moment that you feel that the client is pushing back, any moment that you feel that there's resistance that's there, any moment that you wonder if the client's kind of disconnecting or becoming more guarded, more withdrawn, these are all prime moments to consider using validation on purpose and strategically, until it becomes even just more natural for you to use it organically and constantly. So I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you found this discussion about validation to be helpful to you. Please put some comments and any questions in the comments below so that I can answer them, and have an awesome day. Be well.